So, welcome back, everyone, to week 2 of Reasonings with Jane. My name, doesn't that sound good? That's got a good ring to it, hasn't it?
Yes. It's funny, but
I'm Hannah Marr. I'm Jane's running mate for the Senate for New South Wales for Reason Australia. I'll be facilitating the Q&A at the end of the session this evening. And of course, as always, our host tonight is Walkley Award-winning author and serial tweeter, and of course, Reason Australia's lead candidate for the Senate in New South Wales, Jane Caro. And hello. And joining Jane tonight is climate councillor, founder of Emergency Leaders for Climate Action, and former Fire and Rescue New South Wales Commissioner Greg Mullins.
Hi, everybody.
Hello, Greg. Sorry, I need to not step on you both when you're all saying hello. We're still working out the kinks, it's fine. Greg is an internationally renowned expert in natural disaster response and is passionate about the links between climate change and extreme weather events, which is something that is very topical at the moment. So tonight, of course, in the wake of terrible flooding events, which took place across much of Eastern Australia, Jane and Greg will be discussing topics like disaster response and recovery, planning for a projected increase in major weather events in the future, and of course, government climate policy. And if you have questions about any of these things, then that's great, because we'll be doing a Q&A session at the end. If you would like to ask any questions, you just pop them into the Q&A section, not the chat. If you have specific questions, and you need to open the Q&A menu and put your question in there, and we'll answer those questions at the end. All right, with all of that housekeeping out of the road, I'll hand it over to you, Jane, to take over tonight's webinar.
Thanks, Hannah. I am very excited to have Greg here, well, sort of with me, but not with me, given that we're on the interwebs, because Greg and I go back a very long way. We actually both went to Forest High in Frenchs Forest, and indeed we grew up in Terry Hills, which is where Greg has... How old were you, Greg, when you first started fighting fires?
How old? 12. I was 12, 1971.
There you go. 12-year-old Greg in 1971 with your dad in the... Was it the Terry Hills or the Duffy's Forest Volunteer Fire Brigade?
Well, I had to join Duffy's Forest because Dad said, no, you're too young to join Terry Hills, mate. So I walked, what was it, 4 miles down to Duffy's Forest. I said, can I jump on your fire truck? And they said, yeah, we'll take anyone.
That's right.
When I was at the ripe old age of 16, Dad said, oh, okay, come on, you can join Terry Hills now.
Now it's a step up. Duffy's Forest was kind of like dueling banjos country back in those days. It was a great place to grow up, because it was like being in the country in the city, because it was surrounded by Ku-ring-gai National Park, Ku-ring-gai Chase. And one of the reasons, of course, that the local Rural Fire Brigade was so active was because we got a lot of bushfires even back then. I can remember some doozies when I was growing up. One burnt right up to the back wall of our garden at one point. So we go back a really long way. We're going to keep the stories of my particular checkered youth and Greg's much more respectable youth for the drink we have later. We won't be sharing those with you all tonight. Don't ask, we won't tell. But it was a lot of fun, and we're both passionate supporters of public education as well as of climate action on climate change, because we both benefited. But enough of our reminiscing. Let me get to the point of tonight's webinar. And the first thing I want to ask you about, Greg, is the use we hear a lot of at the moment of that word unprecedented. Have all these natural disasters, and I mean, since 2019, we're talking about catastrophic fires, a catastrophic drought that everyone seems to have forgotten about before then, which was one of the reasons we got the catastrophic fires. And of course, now these catastrophic flooding events. And we've had fires in WA as well. So much happening in just a short time, not to mention a pandemic. Does unprecedented cut it anymore?
You could say, Jane, there's an unprecedented number of references to the word unprecedented these days. So, look, And it's very accurate. Now, we were warned about this for decades by climate scientists, and you and I know, everybody knows the story there, particularly in Australia and other countries, US. They were just ignored, pilloried, pushed into the corner, told to be quiet. But even Ross Garnaut, was it 2008? I think it was 2008, he wrote a report on climate change, and he said that bushfires will increase in intensity and frequency, and this should be directly observable by 2020. Wow. So what happened? Now, so just to put it into perspective, what's unprecedented? The weather. The weather is unprecedented. So we keep breaking records. We keep breaking temperature records, wind velocity records, amount of rain over a specific period. And river levels, river rise levels. So we saw in Lismore a truly unprecedented level, 2 metres above the 1954 level of the massive floods then. So, and that smashed the record out of the ballpark, and homes that never should have been impacted by flood were submerged. So this is where you had all those people's on roofs. And could people have anticipated that? Well, not really, but in terms of fire, we look at Black Summer, and my group tried from April 2019 to warn the Prime Minister specifically. I wrote to him twice on behalf. We had chiefs and deputy chiefs from every fire service in Australia, urban and rural, National Parks and Forestry fire units, some SES commissioners, and we said, Prime Minister, you really need to listen. You're going to need the military. You're going to need more firefighting aircraft, et cetera, This is climate change in action. And apparently that's the bit he didn't like. So he said, I'm not talking to that mob. Deputy Prime Minister called us time wasters. And and then what happened? The hottest, driest year ever recorded in Australia. And we'd been in a drought, and it wasn't the longest drought, but it was the most severe drought that we'd ever had. It was worse than the Millennium Drought because of that 1.4 degrees increase in temperature day and night since 1910 when records began. So everything was tinder dry and the bush exploded. So yes, the word unprecedented, we need to get used to it because the Royal Commission said Black Summer it's the worst ever. We've never had anything like it. Anyone who says that we have has no idea what they're talking about, and we said that at the time. Mm-hmm. And we will see more of these. That's not the new normal, but it's the new extreme. However, there's studies that say by 2040 that will be normal, just on current warming projections. By 2060, the 2019 hottest, driest year ever, where Sydney was just about 50 degrees. I think it was 48.9 degrees. At Penrith, I was fighting fires that day. I remember it. I ended up dehydrated in bed for 2 days after that one. Mm-hmm. That'll be an exceedingly cool year by 2060. And the Royal Commission said, if we don't drive down emissions now, pretty much, and I'll say it, we're screwed. And when I say we're screwed, no fire service, emergency service on the face of the earth can deal with fires like that. We're in survival mode ourselves. I was there that summer as a volunteer. And there's not much you can do to mitigate it. So we must deal. This is our contention. We must deal with the cause, and that's a warming climate. That's emissions, burning coal, oil, gas. Got to stop.
Yeah. I think, fortunately, I think a great many Australians are now convinced of the same thing in a way they never have been before. The problem is that a lot of people in power, whether it's in power in government or in the media or in certain parts of the business community, not all of the business community, thank goodness, are resisting facing the absolute incontrovertible truth of that. And that seems to be our problem because, okay, they are unprecedented, what we've been watching, fire and rain, the two extremes. And I remember that was what the climate scientists have always been saying, that we'll get much hotter summers, but much colder winters. We'll get much drier droughts, but much more torrential and flooding rainfall. That all the weather we have always had will just become more and more extreme at either end of things. And exactly what they predicted has come true. And so the other thing we hear some of our leaders say is no one could have predicted this. And yet that's just a refusal to look at the increasingly urgent predictions. As you pointed out, Ross Garnaut in 2008 accurately predicted practically to the year. It's a way of covering up, surely, their reluctance, unwillingness, incapacity to actually grasp the nettle.
Look, Jane, I think it's, to be fair to the Prime Minister and others, I suppose nobody stuck in a Canberra bubble that has no relation to reality could have anticipated this. But the rest of us are living it and being impacted by it. And I think we can. And look, so what actually worries me now is that the rhetoric from Canberra has changed. So you'll hear senior politicians saying, oh, yes, this is climate change. Australia's a more dangerous place to live these days. But that's not matched. That's greenwashing because it's not matched by action. So we're at the COP26 in Glasgow, the International Climate Conference. Australia turned up with a commitment to go net zero by 2050, as long as we invent some fantastic new technologies. And we had a pamphlet and it said the Australian way, we'll do it the Australian way, technology, not taxes. It's mind-boggling and still, but as we come up to an election, they can't admit that they were wrong. So they'll say, oh yes, 82% of Australians are concerned about climate change. That's according to the Australia Institute. So they know it's an election issue, and good people like you are putting a hand up to say, I want to change the mix down in Canberra and I want them to deal with the issues that are important to Australians. So they're mouthing the words, but they're doing absolutely nothing about it. And we're assessed as the nation, amongst the rich nations, we had the worst climate policies of all. Yeah, so 26 to 28% by 2030, that's nothing. And we're actually still going up in some sectors. So I get really upset about it because my entire working life and now my volunteer life is about helping people. And I was out doing flood relief Tuesday last week, and I felt as powerless as I did during the bushfires because we just had to wait for the rain to stop and hope that it went down, and then look at the ruined homes and the people crying on the side of the road. That's the reality. This is the reality. I was at Bateman's Bay on New Year's Eve fighting fires under a firestorm, a pyroconvective storm connecting with the stratosphere, knocking trees down all around us and wondering if we'd go home, and seeing these poor people homeless, hundreds of homes burnt. That's the reality. But our nation's capital, there's a lot of people in power who are trying to minimise all that, and they're not. Yeah,
they're not taking it seriously, and it's so urgent, and it's such a frightening future. And I mean, we were talking before we came on air about our grandchildren. I feel very ashamed, actually, personally ashamed, that I won't be leaving, or it looks like I won't be leaving, a world in as good a shape to my grandchildren as my grandparents left to me. We have not been good custodians of this planet. What can we do now? I mean, obviously, we can change the government, get people in who are prepared to take urgent action on climate change, really ramp up the changeover to renewable energy rather than energy based on burning fossil fuels. We have the answers. We know what to do to mitigate climate change, but what do we do when the next flood comes? How do we prepare? How do we in some way cope with the inevitable, because it's going to take a long time for us to, well, we've got to stop it at 1.5 degrees. We can't go to 2. And that's going to mean we're still dealing with stuff like this far more often than we want to.
Yeah, and look, the problem, so after COP, the UN said with the pledges made, we're heading for 2.7 degrees by the end of the century. That's catastrophic. That's a breakdown of society as we know it. Food crops will fail. It'll be too hot for people to live in sub-Saharan Africa, parts of the Middle East, parts of Australia. Every year will be a disaster season. The Royal Commission talked about compounding disasters. Every subsequent hit you have, and we've had, 3 big flood events now since the bushfires. There was bushfires, we've had COVID. Governments are going broke, and the insurance companies are going, we can't take more hits like this. So we will get to a point where we're on the ground and can't get up again if we don't deal with the causal factor. So look, I talked to you about going to New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, talking to the fire chiefs and emergency chiefs there, and this has been on our agenda. I was chair of the State Emergency Management Committee at the time, and talked to FEMA officials, Federal Emergency Management Agency officials in the US, and we've been planning for catastrophic disasters. Now, catastrophic disasters like Cyclone Tracy in 1974 that wiped out all the response capability, Hurricane Katrina, Lismore, my fire station, fire and rescue, obliterated. Ambulance, I'm chair of the board for ambulance, obliterated, and also the rescue helicopter base. Someone just put up a thing saying Hat Hill Road, Blackheath. Yes, that's where I got bad dehydration. Sorry, I shouldn't be looking at that.
It's all right.
The big thing is resilience, community resilience, and all this talk about having a new force of responders is well-intentioned, but way off the mark, in my view, and emergency chief's view. You need to empower communities because that's where your first responders are from. We saw that in Lismore. When we send earthquake rescue teams overseas, one part of their training, the search and rescue crew training, is to engage spontaneous responders and organise them and get them pulling out rubble and stuff. So that's getting communities involved in their own salvation, if you like, but the preparation, workshopping with local communities. And this was part of the Royal Commission recommendations that haven't been implemented by this government that's missing in action, that you'd have exercises with communities and with emergency services to say, right, what's the worst case scenario? Then what do we do? Where do we go? And then you get, in California, they've got community emergency response teams who help each other know who's next door, where to get first aid kits, fire extinguishers, drinking water when they have an earthquake. There's a lot to do. I know that's a lot to absorb, but we are heading into a new era, and they'll have another inquiry after this. They'll blame the SES, and they might, sack some senior people or whatever. You'll never see any politicians getting sacked. They'll use senior public servants instead, and then it'll look like they've done something. It's not going to help anyone. We need to recruit lots more people, full-time people, into emergency services locally, and if you just have a force that comes out when there's a catastrophic disaster, it's a waste of money. You want them doing stuff day to day, and part of it's training the community and outreach. And then when it's bad, you've got many more people trained, but they've got the links in the community. So it's a whole new concept. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change put out a report 3 weeks ago saying exactly that: change the mix of money, empower communities, invest in resilience and prevention.
I think this idea that people, in a way, have to be trained to help one another, because I think what I've been hearing from, say, Lismore, which has been in the news most recently, is that the local community felt very totally ignored. They felt they were just left to fend for themselves, which they did as best they could, but they hadn't had the training. They hadn't been prepared for this kind of catastrophe. And that's a horrible feeling of, what the hell do we do? And turning around, looking for someone to take the lead seems to me to have been a very clear source of a lot of the anger of the community. And I think too, there's anger because, as you and I have been talking about, we've known this stuff was coming. You know, we've had Royal Commissions, we've had report after report after report, and to feel that nothing had been put in place, no one was prepared. There was no kind of disaster response of any kind, whether it was any good or not. There just didn't seem to be anything. I mean, they're talking about now moving the town of Lismore completely because it's always had floods, but this one is beyond anything they've ever had before. And the sort of recognition that, as you say, we have to expect more of this, even if we started to reduce emissions down towards, and I mean, we have to hit net zero long before 2050. It's got to be 2030. That's got to be our aim. It's bleedingly obvious. Even if we started doing that, you know, right this minute, still we're going to have to deal with all this stuff. Is moving a whole town any kind of solution? Does that work?
Look, it was actually talked about in Maitland in the 1950s, in Lismore in the 1950s, and the businesses just said, no, we're not moving. This is, you know, there's train lines, there's a river here, there's a, you know, this was Maitland in particular. And there's coal mines up the road. No, we're not moving, and it all fell over. It was horrendously expensive, and people are saying, wow, we know we've got to think about it, but not sure where. In Lismore, the issue is, where do you move it to? Where is there uphill? There's Ganella Bar, but what do we build on top of the people's houses who went there in the first place because of floods? So there's where to. It's horrendously expensive. The town of Grantham, a lot of people would remember the 2011 floods, and I sent search teams up there looking for bodies in the logs and the creeks, and they found quite a few. You know, that was all the emergency services in Australia were assisting, and that was we had firefighters, New South Wales firefighters, cleaning up homes in Brisbane. But the local council with state government and federal government assistance moved the town of Grantham. They paid out the owners, they gave them blocks of land further up the hill, and they relocated the town. So this time they weren't flooded. It was a small town. It cost, I don't know, I think it was well over $100 million, but that's out of the top of my head. It was a lot of money for a very small community. So it's a hugely expensive thing. But what the experts are saying is, look, since 1900, sea levels have come up that far. And the penny dropped with me the other day about these East Coast lows. The pressure is getting lower and lower because they're more intense. It means the storms and the winds are more intense because the atmosphere is hotter. So fluids and gases move quicker. But when you have low pressure, the ocean rises. So you get these king tides when you've got low pressure, and the storm surges move further inland. And then when that makes rain, the rain backs up. So you have this compounding effect. And I was in Manly and I saw places flooded that had never flooded before. Manly Dam was overtopping and we just couldn't get in. It was metres deep, and I've seen quite a few flash floods there, but nothing like that. So all these things compounded to make it worse. So what am I saying? I hope I'm not scaring people, but I sort of hope I am, because we've got people in government who cannot acknowledge this in a way that brings them to a place where they'll actually do anything about it. You've got a coalition who can't get past the Nationals. And there's some good Nationals there who really get this stuff, but they're muzzled and they're bullied. There's way too much testosterone in Parliament. I think it should be made dangerous good, maybe say you can't bring it into Parliament anymore. I'm convinced it beats brain cells. But yeah, you don't have to. And you know, I'm a man, I can say that.
Yeah, I couldn't say that. I'd get crucified.
Yeah, well, you just listen to, it's like a primary school, not a public one, of course, but
no, definitely not.
Where people just fight and argue, and you know, it's question time in Parliament. I mean, I'd never let my grandkids go and listen because I'd like them to be polite and respectful of people. I'm not going to learn that. And that's the basic problem there. But look, back to, they formed the National Recovery and Resilience Authority and put a person in charge who is a former Liberal national politician. They've got a $4.8 billion bucket of money. And you probably don't know, Jane, you know where they got it? They raided an education fund. That was put aside for education, but they grabbed that, said, look, we've got this new money. They've spent 50 million out of 4.8 billion. They've earned 800 million in interest. And they had a couple of $100 million late last year in requests for flood mitigation works, including Lismore, and they knocked them back. So this is bordering on criminal negligence as far as my group are concerned. And, you know, we've been around the racetrack a few times. They've got, you know, probably 1,000 years of collective experience, and ex-directors general of Emergency Management Australia, fire and SES chiefs. And we're just watching this, going, are you serious? Are you, yeah. We'd say more than that, but I won't say it here.
Yeah. But what I get from, you know, when you say I don't want to scare people, but at the same time you feel like saying, well, what do we do? We can't pretend. The government appears to want to pretend that these things happen and they'll go away and we won't need to worry about them again. But nobody, except it seems some of the people in our government, actually believe that's true. And I think people are scared. I think we've seen it ourselves, you know, either with the rain, even if we weren't ourselves directly affected, we've seen neighbours, we've seen friends, we've seen locations that we know very well from our youth, you know, and that kind of brings it home much more closely and personally. So I almost feel we have to feel frightened, because somebody said to me a long time ago something that I think is very wise, and they said, human beings don't change until it gets too uncomfortable to stay the same. My hope is that we are now getting too uncomfortable to stay the same, and that we will start demanding that our leaders take the necessary action to cap global warming at 1.5, which is all we can do at the moment. And I mean, the ADF, people call for them and want them to go and help and do all of that kind of thing. And that sounds to me like a sensible idea. But the ADF aren't necessarily expert in dealing with this kind of thing. I mean, they're trained to fight, aren't they? Well,
look, precisely. And I take back to April 2019 again. And I've been, you know, as chair of the State Emergency Management Committee, I raised this years ago after other disasters, but it's a very convoluted system. It's called Defence Assistance to the Civil Community. There's two levels, there's DAC 1, DAC 2, and DAC 1's a local base. The commander can release some trucks and people for a local emergency. DAC 2 goes to the Prime Minister, and it's a state saying we're overwhelmed or we need specific help. And it's convoluted, takes a lot of time. The Royal Committee, you see this time, gee, not fixed yet. But the fundamental thing is we can't keep relying on the people who are trained and equipped to look outward and protect our borders and our international interests, to keep fixing up things internally. And it comes back to why Peter Cosgrove said, leave them alone, because if we have a war and they're all fixing up bushfire damage and flood damage, look out. And because we're drawing down their capability, they're not training in what they're meant to do, and they're doing dangerous stuff they're actually not really capable of doing. There's lots of ready, willing, disciplined hands and some big trucks that can be modified once we take the guns off, but that's not what they're there for. And this government has thrown them at nursing homes, COVID hotels, COVID vaccination centres, floods, bushfire cleanup. It's the get out of jail free card for let's just mobilise the military, and because then it looks like I'm doing something. And I'll never forget, because I was so thoroughly angry after being at Bateman's Bay on New Year's Eve, the Prime Minister had a press conference on, I think it was the 3rd of January 2020. I get furious. So it was an advertisement to the Liberal Party, and he released a video with ADF and firefighters in it, saying what a great job, how good am I and how good is the Liberal Party? And it was the head of ADF, General Campbell, went to the Prime Minister and said, that's inappropriate, pull it down. And he did. Shane Fitzsimmons, there's another local, Jane, as you know.
Yes, I know. We've read them all in Terry Hills and Duffy's Forest, yeah.
He came out, you know, there was a catastrophic fire day, and I was out on the fire line somewhere, can't even remember where it was that day. But he said, gee, it would have been nice to know prior to this, rather than reading about it in the newspaper and hearing about it on the evening news, where are these troops going and what are they doing? It was just because they were languishing in the media. And so the ADF are being used as pawns, and they don't like it, but they'll always be there for a catastrophic disaster, but we've got to stop drawing them down all the time. And this time, totally appropriate, people of Lismore, Ballina, you know, the up around Brisbane, of course, they need every assistance we can give, but it's not sustainable. So we have to look at this other thing, and we're saying build up the existing emergency services within communities so more people are trained and do the community outreach using that bucket of money. And the other thing that we're saying is stop subsidising fossil fuel companies and use those billions to bolster the emergency services. The money's there.
Yeah, it's all about what we choose to spend it on. This seems to me like a good moment to stop our conversation a bit and go to some of the questions, because I noticed that we've got a few in the Q&A portal, and Hannah will take over and ask those of you, Greg. I love your anger, by the way. I think it is important, and I love the fact that there's so much anger across the Australian community at the moment about a lot of different issues, but climate change in particular. I just think the public know this is urgent. We need to do stuff now.
So a couple of people have asked, basically, despite everything that we've talked about so far tonight, why isn't the government doing anything to tackle climate change? Is it entirely about vested interests or their donors or ideology? What exactly is the issue stopping them from moving forward on this incredibly important issue?
Look, I don't think anyone really knows. It's like the great mysteries in life. You know, it may be in 1,000 years they'll work out why there was this disconnect between reality and our government at the moment. But did the debacle of the Prime Minister flagging a net zero by 2050 target and listening to the Deputy Prime Minister saying it's all rubbish and no, you know, and I don't agree with it personally, but I'll leave it to the party room. And that was very telling. And then, you know, where I am, the local member professes to have strong climate credentials. So he's a Liberal national member, but said individuals can't do anything. And I assume he meant, he said that on Q&A, and I assume he meant if you're a member of the Liberal National Party. So I don't see people crossing the floor on climate because maybe they get bullied. And I came, you know, my background, work background, all male organisation for years. I brought in 50-50 male-female recruitment to try and redress that imbalance, and it had a huge positive impact on culture. And so we need that in Canberra. But I just think there's a bunch of bullies down there who butt heads, but they seem to be only driven by the polls and by the front page of the Australian. And so there's just a disconnect with what real people who are suffering or working hard to try to deal with issues. There's just a real disconnect, and they do not listen to the science. They definitely do not listen to the climate science because it's so clear. The head of the UN Gutierrez the other day, you know, when this latest report came out with the Australasia chapter mapping out floods, the bushfires, the droughts, the heat waves. And he said, this is an existential threat. When are we going to take this seriously? Well, in Australia, maybe not till we've got a new government.
A question here from Roy, who asks about the people who are displaced during cataclysmic events like fires and floods. So Roy says, we've once again seen devastating floods in the Northern Rivers, causing and exacerbating further homelessness across the region. Why doesn't New South Wales have a disaster hub of suitable housing ready to roll out during bushfires and so forth? If MSF can come into a disaster zone and have a hospital set up in less than a week, why can't we open up hubs of places for people to go when they're evacuated or made homeless?
Yeah, great question. And it's a logistical and supply question that I've been speaking to people in the private sector. Well, today, this afternoon, I was talking to someone who's working that area, shipping containers being made into totally self-contained with solar power and a battery, and all you need is to hook it up to water, or there's a water filtration plant. They're 2 bedrooms, I think, kitchen, shower, toilet, bit of a living room. They're deployed out there in bushfire areas, but there's still a lot of people living in tents. Now, and just numbers, some numbers, bushfires, worst bushfires in terms of a whole lot, on every measure actually, but loss of homes, 3,094 across Australia, 2,476 here in New South Wales. Biggest loss prior to that was 226 in 2013. So exponential. So there's thousands were homeless, and many still are. But look at how many homes in the floods. People are saying 18,000. You know, multiply that by 3 or 4. That's how many people are going to be looking for housing. So, and this is where the Royal Commission warned of compounding disasters, hit after hit after hit, cost after cost after cost. And we're throwing the COVID pandemic and all the money that's being spent. It sends governments broke, and people end up without a roof over their head. So
we already have a homelessness issue before all these people lost their homes. You know, we have, I think it's about 100,000 people who sleep rough every night, many of whom are children. So we're just making it worse and worse and worse and worse.
Yeah, so look, sorry, I've forgotten the person's name who asked that question, but I don't have an answer. But ignoring the Royal Commission recommendations, the 80 recommendations, which went to the heart of these issues, and it's, again, an abrogation of responsibility by the Morrison government, because they have the suggested answers in their hands. They've just got to pull everyone together, but they're saying, oh no, that recommendation wasn't for us, it was for the insurance industry or critical infrastructure or states and territories. It was their Royal Commission, they called it, but they won't coordinate response to it.
So what would a government look like that did that actually went to the Royal Commission and put those recommendations into practice? What kind, like, obviously not this government, but what, I mean, how hard is it to do?
Look, it's machinery of government stuff. It's process. It's basically process, and public service departments, the professional public service, when you wind it up and say do that, they can do anything. And what I'm seeing in Canberra, so one of the recommendations, this is boring. The Royal Commission report is boring. If you have sleeping problems, read it at night, because, you know, and I have to, I've got to get my mind around this, but there's so much in there. But one of the things was to streamline the administration within the federal government. So the government, what can we do? Let's form a National Recovery and Resilience Authority. And we said, that's great, you need that. New South Wales has already done it. You know, whether it's all as effective as it should be. But then Prime Minister said, it's under me. And Emergency Management Australia is under Home Affairs. So there's an immediate disconnect, and they actually compete. So, you know, 2 dogs on a tree, seeing how high. Yeah, it's unbelievable the waste and the disconnect. Australian Climate Service, so 3 agencies have put people in, $200 million. That's been squandered. They haven't done any climate research for the states and territories at all. So it doesn't take much. It takes leadership and vision and somebody to say, we have to solve this issue. We're going to take our hands off. There's a great deal of micromanagement in Canberra because they're terrified of bad media. So they manage everything. When you micromanage, we've all worked under micromanagers, nothing happens because it's fear and blame. You've got to do exactly as they say or you get smashed. That's what's happening in Canberra. It's a micromanaging government. So the public service has gone, and where that was most exemplified was in Senate estimates recently. The head of Treasury was asked, how much climate modelling have you done in the last 8 years of this government? And he said, none, because we weren't asked to. What? So we're not modelling the future for Australia and how we could have a better, stronger economy? No, because they're not allowed to.
Vacuum.
Dreadful. So you talk about how disasters and weather events are becoming exponentially more intense and more damaging. Madeline asks, so as we sort of move into the future and these disasters get worse as the climate warms, how do you see emergency response evolving to cope? How should it evolve? How do you fight a bushfire when in a time when Black Summer is the norm?
Yeah. So in one way, the glib answer is say, well, you don't, and you on the worst days you just seek cover. But what's that cover look like? This is in the Royal Commission report. Australian Standard 3959, building in bushfire prone areas, needs to be ramped up so that homes are almost fireproof. Looking at making land use planning, it must be mandatory to look at flood risk, fire risk. That's in the Royal Commission report. So you won't be building on floodplains anymore. You won't be building in catastrophic fire paths anymore. And if you're near anything like that, a natural hazard like that, which the Australian Climate Service will model and provide information to local and state governments on, you will have requirements so that you can survive. So there'll be community evacuation centres with mattresses, food stores, water. Another recommendation of the Royal Commission. There'll be annual exercises and the community will know what's going on. There'll be a national app to warn people that everyone will have. It's consistent in every state and territory. It's all in the report. So we've got the blueprint, and of those 80 recommendations, as soon as the Prime Minister's department took it over with the NRRA, it was being reported every 2 months, I think, or maybe monthly, by David Littleproud, who was the Emergency Management Minister, who I've got issues with, but he's done a reasonable job when he was there. And Emergency Management Australia, when it came under the Department of Prime Minister, they stopped reporting in May 2021. So we don't even know where they were. But the last report, they'd acted on 14 of the 80 recommendations and then only partially.
No, you go, Hannah.
No, I know, it's dreadful. We might do just a couple more really quick questions. We are sort of at the end of time, so we won't take any more new questions, but a quick one from Suze, who wants to know your view on whether volunteers are a sustainable model for disaster response, and is more funding and training going to help communities be more sustainable? You kind of touched on that before, that the way forward is to actually prepare communities themselves rather than have volunteer agencies ready to swoop in.
Yeah, great question, Suze. So just numbers, raw numbers, there's 300,000 emergency service personnel in Australia. 20,000 of them are paid professionals. 280,000 of them are volunteer professionals. So we need to double that. And why do I say that? Some of you would be community fire unit volunteers. Something came in after 1994 bushfires. They're not not firefighters as such, but they've got basic equipment. They're trained to recognise bushfire risk, to prepare their homes. It's a hugely successful community resilience program in the urban bushland fringe. 600 units, thousands of volunteers, 6,000 volunteers who, and I've seen it in action, Lane Cove National Park in 2001. I was in charge there in the 94 fires and released fire trucks to go and fight the fire front because they could mop up afterwards. But that's the concept, and that's true community resilience. So maybe not formal volunteers in emergency services, because the demographic, it's less people joining, they're getting older, but train up everybody. And so everybody knows, and you have community hubs. Community recovery starts at the local level. If it's done a long way away, it won't address the things really needed. So, and I know you've only got a minute. So
I think we have time for one final question, and it's a good question from an anonymous attendee who wants to know if, Greg, have you ever considered running for Parliament? Leadership
Yes.
based on empathy and evidence is what we sorely need. Have you ever considered it?
no, others did for me. And look, I'll be really honest. I was approached, and it filled me with horror, because I actually think we don't need more men. And I really mean this passionately. I think that there's a basic dysfunction because it's a male-dominated area. Personally, I would have great difficulty with some of the people who are down there, and I wouldn't trust myself to be civil. And so I think there's much better people than me. And I'm a bit damaged. I've got PTSD, I'm worn out, and I just want to serve my local communities, do what I can in a national sense by speaking up, because I'm not frightened of them. They don't frighten me, and they're not going to bully me. But there's some really good, strong independent candidates, and some from some of the other parties. And there's some Liberals and Nationals who really get this stuff, and they're the ones we're going to seek out and get them in, and get Jane there. Because Jane's cool.
Thanks, Greg.
Thank you, Greg. Yeah.
Cool.
And Hannah, sorry.
Oh, of course. It's worth pointing out, I guess, that, you don't have to necessarily win a seat in Parliament to make a difference and to make change in government. You are doing wonderful advocacy work, Greg, through the Climate Council and through Emergency Leaders for Climate Action. So thank you for all that you do and all that you've done on behalf of us all here, I think.
And thank you for the courage you've shown, not just in facing catastrophic fires, which obviously you showed, but in speaking up and saying that you are not afraid of them and you will speak truth to power. That seems to me what's happening at the moment. There is a groundswell of Australians who are speaking truth to power. Some of them have some testosterone, but a lot of them don't, or they do, but not in the same way. I don't know. I don't understand the physiology of that, but anyway, great. Thank you.
Okay, let's wrap up there then. Thank you once again, Greg. You've been a wonderful guest tonight. And of course, thank you, Jane, for hosting again this evening. Everyone, we are doing this every week. So keep an eye on Jane and Reason's social media. We will be announcing our next guest very soon in the coming days. And of course, if you want to get involved, if you want to help out in any way that you can, whether it's volunteering, whether it's donating, or even just keeping up to date with what we're doing, head to Jane Currow for Reason, the website, or onto Twitter, where you will find a lot of stuff from Jane, on Facebook, on TikTok. We're on TikTok now.
Grandma goes to TikTok.
Exactly. We're all over the socials. So please keep an eye on us, help out in any way that you can. And of course, we'll see you all next week for another exciting episode of Reasonings with Jane. We'll see you then.
Thanks, Hannah.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.